According to the UNESCO definition, we'll be defining cultural heritage as the legacy of physical artifacts and intangible attributes of a group or society that are inherited from past generations, maintained in the present, and bestowed for the benefit of future generations. These tangible culture include things like architecture, works of art, artifacts, and while intangible culture all includes things like folklore, traditions, and language. Just a little note on the map here on your right. This is a map of first millennium AD heritage sites, mostly from Thailand, Myanmar, and Malaysia. It's not comprehensive, but it's for general reference, just to give you an idea of where some of these sites that we'll be talking about are located. Pasha will explain a little bit more about that in just a moment. For the definition of conflict, we'd like to define the term very broadly, given the numerous academic disciplines that we have in the room today, and this will allow for a wider range of perspectives. So we will define conflict just simply as clashes of interest and failures of coordination. So our panel today will focus on the intersection between heritage and conflict. Heritage can be used as a means of cooperation. The ability to move groups of people in a single direction with a powerful voice can be an engine for change and progress. However, heritage can also be counterproductive, and as distinctions between various histories and identities continue to divide populations along ill-defined or arbitrary social and territorial boundaries. In this manner, heritage becomes a barrier to cooperation, and the diversity of voices can be subsumed under homogeneous identity or pitted against one another. The panel today will explore both these and uniting and dividing aspects along various focused areas and groups. Just to broadly lay out what each panelist will be doing today, we'll each provide a different perspective on conflicts from the region, from our area of research that involve the intersection between heritage and that conflict. The presentations will cover roughly 4 different aspects. These include the problems and potentials in the economic dimension, as well as problems and potentials in the political dimension. Lastly, we'll have a discussion with all of you. Luckily, we have a pretty small group, so we can have a much more back and forth kind of dialogue. But we'll open the floor later on. And for now, we'll start off with Pacha, who will be presenting on her research.
Thank you, Justin. As an economist who has the luck of being able to engage with archaeology and heritage, I want to draw attention to how underdevelopment of heritage as an industry is leading to conflict of interest, and among those within the nations and between the nations of Southeast Asia itself, instead of being able to kind of read from the potential of heritage sites in general. Economics problem associated to heritage is more like constraints against economic potentials that can be drawn from the heritage sector. And by heritage sector, I mean heritage classified as industries, as economies, as a political, social development, socio-economic development scope in general. Before that, let's establish that heritage has exponential property in terms of economic development. Studies elsewhere in Turkey, Greece, and the United States has revealed that heritage sites resulted in 1.7 to approximately 3 times multiplier effects in growth. Right? That's significantly more than placing malls or markets in certain locations to generate development. Why we don't have this, I don't know. Maybe we need more economists to actually determine this benefit in the long run. Right? Heritage can become a powerful force in terms of developing comparative advantage for smaller economies. Think of this as a publicly endowed good that has been with us for a really long time. At the national level, it has the potential of distributing urban sectors and income sources to rural communities, because most of the sites, if you see in the map, are located in rural areas. They're not in big major cities. If you look in terms of capacity, Thailand alone has over 2,000 sites. Now, barely 10% of this has been registered, has been surveyed, and has been developed. Okay? That's a lot of lost potential we're looking at. So in terms of defining, so where is this problem coming from? We have to look at this in terms of defining benefits. How do you find the right payoff matrix? Application-wise, heritage has traditionally been dichotomously viewed by academics and policymakers as either being a force that represents humanity, which doesn't have anything to do with profit or money, or it is a form of economic asset, with academics and NGO adopting the former view while governments adopting the latter. This often leads to disputes about benefits and costs of historical and cultural sites through tourism and its impact on communities. particularly intangible heritage like the cultural and evolution of the local community. More importantly, it is missing agency of the people who are now living on the sites, which are mostly located in rural areas. Government find themselves in situations where they enact laws to prevent looting, trespassing, but cannot enforce these laws. As a result, estimated 80% of the potential archaeological information only in Thailand alone has been estimated that it's lost beyond retrieval. On the other hand, academic and NGO efforts to study heritage is viewed as activity for the urban educated. It's very foreign from local community. It provides no direction, tangible benefits to the community inhabiting the land, which often leads to cooperation resistance from local communities. With three groups of people disagreeing on how they see heritage, development does not move forward. However, Douglas North uses institutional economics to tell us that if the information feedback of consequences of choice were complete, then individuals with the same utility function would gradually correct their perception and over time converge to a common equilibrium. You need to inform people and generate more knowledge sector. In practice, government needs to pay more attention to sectors, and the intelligentsia needs to acknowledge that humanities and ideas alone are great, but preservation also is an economic cost. Right? And both the government and local communities and local communities will need these things. This will prevent local communities from depending or making economic gains through subsistence looting, which we don't want. Right? And subsistence looting itself is not very small. If you look at the degree of organized looting, art crime smuggling, illegal trafficking, counterfeiting that is happening in Southeast Asia. The next problem is how the framework is set up for heritage industry development. The current narrow focus on tourism does not only alienate communities from heritage and cultural sites, but also create constraints towards achieving true economic potentials that historical and cultural heritage can provide. Heritage signifies two dimensions in terms of the economy: human capital development and asset development. So the first one concerns skills and white-collar sectors, while the second form of asset concerns how we treat scarce public resources, in this case, heritage and cultural sites. Heritage policy in Southeast Asia focus more on the latter, right? So it aims at developing the site as a tourist location. Tourism is developing rapidly in mainland Southeast Asia, spilling over from Thailand into the CLMV countries. We can now see the impact, both positive and negatives, on areas such as Bagan and Angkor. When tourism is the ultimate goal behind development, projects often alienate community from engaging in the development process. Specialists in architecture and engineering are imported from elsewhere, often according to funding contracts. As a result, the intelligentsia view this as alienating process that says that most of the identity of heritage. So whoever comes in, Western Asian, in development, designs how heritage should be, and the local has no gains from it. We can see this in the case of large-scale conservation projects like Sukhothai Historical Park, and more clearly in the development of heritage sites in Luang Prabang, where most of the heritage-related activities are conducted by foreign and often Western firms and organizations. Heritage development at its full potential needs to be viewed as human capital development schemes, rather than tourism scheme, with complementary policies from finance, environment, tourism, and commerce, and the industrial side. So it's not only the Ministry of Tourism or Culture that's in charge of this. In a way, you seek to build a city life through heritage and not around heritage. This is something that requires a lot of cooperation between intra-government and local entities. As ASEAN moves forward, cultural and historical heritage becomes a key to spatial and temporal zoning and interactions. It will need proper institutions, which are currently lacking, as trust funds, such as trust fund body and a more dynamic heritage law and cooperation to support development. But more importantly, tapping into potential economic growth through heritage sectors requires an advancement of creative and knowledge economy. This requires a greater access to continuing education among adults, so people in the rural area should have skilled trainings that they may need. If we acknowledge this is a low human capital problem, then that could be tapped into, then we can start discussing the wider context. Why Southeast Asia is not capitalizing as much from heritage other than through tourism and internal conflict of interest within the countries between the people, intelligentsia, and the state. This brings me to my experiences on political aspects of the problem. We are discussing about government stakes, so I want to bring up institutions in ASEAN and its role on heritage management. So far, there are two main bodies in Southeast Asia affiliated to Cultural and Historical Heritage Management, the SEMIO SPAFA, which is Southeast Asian Regional Center for Archaeology and Fine Arts. The main aim is to promote more professional competence, awareness, preservation. It's only done among intelligentsia. Okay? The second body on the broader scope is the Southeast Asian Minister of Education, the ASEAN Committee on Cultural and Information. So this is a more broad agreement on ASEAN in general to promote cultural heritage sites. But if you look at the projects that's been coming out of that, it's mainly for tourism and more visual awareness of culture rather than cultural preservation. Presently, not all ASEAN members are part of the UNESCO 1970 Convention, which means initiatives to protect cultural and historical heritage are more difficult to synchronize. This does not include clashes between national identity and how heritage is used to formulate modern nation state, something which people in this panel is more qualified to talk about than me. I view heritage as an opportunity to lower urban-rural divide, as well as diversifying Southeast Asia economic potential and competitiveness. For mature economic centers like Singapore, Bangkok, Jakarta, Manila, and Kuala Lumpur, the heritage consumption is a growing demand that coincides with expanding middle class with more income. Okay? You don't want these people leaving the region because it generates, you want tourism within the region. Domestic and intra-regional tourism and trade is growing. There is no better time to exploit this potential. More importantly, heritage has an absolute advantage component. You cannot reproduce Angkor Wat anywhere. Building a scheme towards more value-added industry that surrounds heritage will increase income for the economy. My experiences with the Utong area have revealed that there are returning middle class who used to work in other provinces. They work in gemstone factories, mining companies, and they're returning to that particular area because their hometown, their own village, is settled on a historical and environmental heritage site. And their efforts to revive these sites does not only involve tourism, but it also involves cultivating an industry. They're trying to turn rare plants that are only found in the area into products they can sell. Their problem is that they don't have the necessary legal and knowledge protection or the financial resources to do so. So this becomes an issue where the government needs to start stepping in as a provider for local areas like this that wants to develop. We see this model successfully happening in areas like Chiang Mai, where there are good models and creative cities initiative being established. It's generally acknowledged that if Southeast Asia wants to compete with China and India as a region stuck in between as smaller economies, it needs to move more towards knowledge and creative-based economies. So setting up the necessary legal mechanism is very essential for the movement. And that brings me to a point on how we need to set up these institutions and move away from the workshop that limits engagement to intelligentsia, and at the same time draw in more private actors on the grassroots level and those from the urban sectors. So this facilitates credit transfer and generate new financial innovations that would help sites like people in Utong create their own businesses from this industry. Thank you.
Thanks, Pacha. If we can move down the line here.
Thank you.
So let's keep moving down the line here. Veronica, if you could give us your presentation, please.
Yeah, well, as the archaeologist of the group, I would like to draw attention to archaeological sites and their surrounding economic and political problems, looking particularly at the case of underwater cultural heritage, which I will call now UCH. So by definition, UCH is any kind of archaeological remains that have been submerged underwater continuously for over 100 years. A large portion of this kind of heritage is comprised of shipwrecks. Now, shipwrecks are very important resources for archaeology because materials that have been underwater for a really long time are usually very well preserved. And the fact that people cannot access them until 50 years ago have actually protected the shipwrecks. So they are like time capsules, and we like to emphasize the idea of that time capsule. So this often includes organic material, which is very difficult to find actually inside. So we have been able to track a lot of information in terms of what was traded at certain points throughout the whole world. So up to now, Cambodia is the only country in Southeast Asia that has ratified the UNESCO Convention for the Protection of Underwater Cultural Heritage. which is an international agreement aimed at the protection of this kind of sites. The rest of the countries in Southeast Asia have different approaches to UCH, but that will not be part of my talk today, although if you have any questions regarding this issue, I'll be happy to actually talk. So instead, I will briefly present 2 case studies on the way UCH is entrenched in economic and political issues. In terms of economy, I would like to focus on the diving industry and local management of underwater sites. Over the last decade, the number of diving tourists have risen sharply. While this can be seen as a good thing for the local economy, the interests of the different stakeholders, as Pasha mentioned, are not the same. The first problem that needs to be acknowledged is that underwater sites are non-renewable resources, and they are vulnerable to different factors like, for example, fishing, bad weather, looting, and obviously mass tourism, particularly new divers who have bad buoyancy control. So they flap around underwater and they can damage a lot of archaeological material. The other problem that needs to be considered is how to ensure that the local community can benefit from the use of UCH sites on their own terms and in a controlled way that guarantees equal access to opportunities to all members of the community. Since Pasha has already made great points about this aspect, I will not go into it. So I will focus more on the preservation issue. So controlling divers to ensure protection of underwater sites is very difficult, obviously. So before trying to develop any site for tourism, it is important to take this issue into consideration and devise ways of protecting the integrity of the site. A good example on how the economic potential of UCH sites could be fulfilled can be found in Indonesia. The Liberty shipwreck in Bali is a very popular site for divers. It's a World War II shipwreck that can be explored by divers of all levels because of the location of the wreck. It's in an angle and the coast that's quite steep, so the upper section can be dived by snorkelers, and the deeper sections can go up to 40 meters. So the government of Indonesia has had a broad approach to the management of the site through monitoring and local management. The Department of Fisheries, which looks after the site, has been monitoring the condition of the wreck to determine the factors that affect the integrity. The main problems that have been documented are environmental, so mostly storms and earthquakes that are actually making the shipwreck slide to the bottom, and obviously human action, as I mentioned before, people with no buoyancy control. As a result of this discovery, the Indonesian archaeologists monitoring the site are now making recommendations to establish certain regulations to diving activities. They have been working with the local community to figure out the best ways to implement these policies, especially because local diving centers have the ability to control these divers. Since they have this ability to regulate to a certain extent the behavior of the divers and manage the site on a day-to-day basis, they were very fast incorporated into the development conversations. And the engagement of the local community in the protection of the site was therefore, as I said, identified as a key issue to ensure the protection of the site. So after this back and forth with the local community, they came up with this really ingenious idea of incorporating a traditional law called awig-awig to encourage good behavior. So this awig-awig law has a set of rules that have to be followed by the members of the community, and if some of them do something that is banned, then the perpetrator is banished from the group. So the result is being shunned by the community. Seeing this as an opportunity, the local community agreed to incorporate aspects of cultural heritage management into the awig-awig law, and that has actually encouraged the protection of the site, because local people are actually looking after the site, so they are the ones that are interested in maintaining the site for their own economic development and ensuring that divers are actually having a good behavior instead of competing with each other. So far it seems that this has been much more efficient than imposing abstract laws from a central government that often does not resonate with the local community. So by listening to the local community and finding ways of engaging them in the protection of cultural heritage sites, cultural heritage tourism can be actually conducted in a sustainable way. Now we turn to politics and how conflicts affect UCH. And for that, I will draw upon the South China Sea territorial dispute, to which Justin will come back later. For those of you new to the issue, there are 6 primary claimants to various disputed groups of islands and smaller territories in the South China Sea, namely Brunei, China, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam. The dispute became lethal at times in the past and stands as a potential flashpoint for these states going forward. It is not my aim to pick sides, but rather to reflect on how the dispute affects UCH and ways of using soft diplomacy, if I may use the term, to minimize some of the issues. The region of reefs, shoals, and islands that are at the heart of the dispute have a historical reputation for being navigation hazards. There are many accounts of ships running into shallow waters of the reefs and sinking, which points to a great potential of this area in terms of underwater cultural heritage. In fact, we know that at some point in the 19th century, a European ship sunk in the area and got into one of the islands, and there were Vietnamese there who had shipwrecked a few months earlier. So there's a constant flow of people going there and sinking with their boats. So as discussed before, shipwrecks are an incredible source for the study of the past. So this area is like Disneyland for underwater archaeologists. Through the analysis of shipwreck cargoes, we can theorize on transregional trade patterns and even infer some data on life on board ships. The analysis of the hull remains is an even more important matter. By studying the technology and the material used to make the ship, we can have an idea of where it came from and in some cases where it has stopped. And I want to draw now here the case of the Belitung ship. The Belitung ship sailed across the Indian Ocean in the 9th century before it sunk in Indonesia. We know this because the construction technique of the ship corresponds to the dhows made in the West Indian Ocean. And it's more probably that the Arabian Peninsula, that the ship arrived from the Arabian Peninsula. The hull was repaired with material that can only be found in Singapore, so we know that the ship actually stopped in the region to be refitted. There are several shipwrecks located in the disputed territories, and at the moment most of the work has been halted. In one instance, a joint Philippine-French research vessel was followed by Chinese military vessels as they were working in disputed territories. And the Chinese military vessel actually informed them every day for 3 days that they were trespassing Chinese territorial waters. So it was just using a megaphone. It was some sort of harassment to keep them out of the region. Now the research team finally decided to leave after 3 days, and they have not returned since. There have been some news lately that China's new program to train underwater archaeologists. So there is a clear interest from China to conduct underwater research, but this appears to have been politicized by some clusters of people within China, if we're to believe the news. China's claim on the region rests on what they see as their historical use of the South China Sea. So there is an interest to excavate shipwrecks that would further this claim. They are not alone in this strategy. The Philippines also held similar claims. However, we have to realize that ships were trans-regional. They moved across borders, loading and unloading cargo in the ports of call along the route. So we could say that they transcend ideas of nation and become items of universal value. Another question we need to ask ourselves is whether the construction of the artificial islands that China has conducted so far have affected UCH. As mentioned before, the area has great potential for shipwrecks. So it would be good to know whether any surveys were conducted before work related to these artificial islands started. And we don't have any sort of information regarding this issue. So if no surveys were conducted, then it is very possible that we're losing an important page of the history of the South China Sea. So in this particular case, we can see that cultural heritage is being politicized in an international conflict. And as a result, we may be compromising our knowledge of the past. I want to finish with a good example on how to use UCH to encourage cultural heritage and cooperation. Since the early 2000s, there have been several regional training courses to develop the expertise needed to work on underwater sites. This was first established in Sri Lanka, and then in 2009, the training actually moved to Thailand. The first set of 3 foundation training courses for the protection of underwater cultural heritage was run by UNESCO Bangkok between 2009 and 2011 for trainees of different academic backgrounds from all of the Asia-Pacific region. A number of specific workshops were also organized to complement the initial training. The training project has now been taken over regionally by SPAPA CMU. To date, 100 local experts have received training. And these efforts to develop the discipline in the region resulted in the organization of the inaugural UNESCO Asia-Pacific Conference on Underwater Cultural Heritage, the APCONF in Manila 2011. Maritime archaeology is now well established in Southeast Asia and is speaking about momentum. While the first APCONF gathered around 100 participants, the second edition, celebrated in Hawaii in 2013, gathered 139. The next one is going to be in Hong Kong in 2017, so we'll see what happens in that one. So during the training course, which runs for 3 weeks, participants have to live together in the training facilities and learn how to dive and work underwater. This has strengthened the ties between local archaeologists and improved cooperation among the different cultural heritage departments of Southeast Asia. The Asia-Pacific Conference, on the other hand, is serving as a platform for further networking among people from different countries, including China, India, Sri Lanka, and the Pacific Islands. So perhaps this could be a good example of how to generate special spaces of interaction that will help overcome, to some extent, political issues.
Thank you. And then Nathan?
Right. So I'll spend the bulk of my time with an overview of kind of Malaysia and its struggles to kind of forge its current contemporary national identity, but also we'll discuss a bit about ASEAN, especially when we get to the kind of discussion about migration. So with regard to Malaysia, in terms of economics, contemporary Malaysia has tried to address vestiges of its colonial past by kind of working to rebalance society's structure so that Bumi Putras, which literally means sons of the soil, and so technically includes both ethnic Malays as well as other indigenous people like the Iban and Padazan, but has often been associated with predominantly Malays, obtain a more equitable share of both the agricultural and commercial sectors of the economy. However, needless to say, this has not been without conflict. Against the backdrop of a deteriorating socioeconomic situation in the 1960s, itself perceived already along racial lines, Malays and non-Malays alike reason to feel economic dissatisfaction. This was further inflamed then by ethnic riots that took place in 1969 on the back of an election that kind of threatened the Malay majority in the coalition's parliamentary representation. So in the aftermath of those riots and the state of emergency that was declared, the country instituted a commitment to positive affirmative action and put in place what was called the new economic policy at the time. Although the initial project had two prongs, an emphasis on poverty eradication as well as economic restructuring along racial lines, in practice and in the minds of average Malaysians at the time and certainly today, policy is more often associated with the latter, and it generates resentment among various sections of the population. The new economic policy, the NEP, was then followed by 3 further plans and is most recently seen in the new economic model that's currently in place, all of which, while nominally different and have gradually shifted from race-based to more merit-based policies, continue to represent elements in an overall policy framework that I think many, both non-Malay and Malays, still perceive as problematic. Certainly, I think in the contemporary area, especially for middle-class Malaysians that are working and kind of looking for lucrative economic opportunities in professional sectors, this is a common kind of refrain that's brought up. So I think what's nice to see here is that this is the case where the economic very clearly and very quickly bleeds into the political. So we have a nation here attempting to reconcile kind of its desire to promote the heritage of one group while simultaneously trying to foster a broader national consensus. I think the extent to which one has been achieved at the cost of the other, I think, is an open question, and one I think will be fruitful for discussion. It certainly hasn't helped that Malaysia's political parties have often reinforced those ethnic and religious divisions. Though it's nominally ruled by the same coalition and National Front, that coalition is made up of 3 ethnically oriented parties. And it's also important to note that there have been conflicts over the instruction in schools. So in terms of math and science, there have been a number of policy shifts in terms of deciding whether those subjects should be taught in Malay or Bahasa Malay or in English. And so most recently the country has chosen to return to Bahasa Malaysia after spending 6 years teaching those subjects in English. And this is also in addition to the ever-present question of whether the country maintains its vernacular schools. So often most national schools are functioning in the medium of Bahasa Malay, but they have the kind of Chinese and the Indian or Hindu vernacular schools. And so these schools we teach the primary language of instruction is Mandarin and Tamil. And so again, the question is, do these help or hinder the development of a more cohesive identity? It's one that the country continues to struggle with, but I think it's one to kind of flag up at this point. I should say, of course, that at this point my discussion is fairly limited in terms of when I'm talking about Peninsular Malaysia. So when we consider Sabah, Sarawak, on the island of Borneo, we can talk about the Iban, the Padazan, the Mur, and other indigenous peoples. To note there that Islam is less predominant, you've got the Christian identity for some of these groups. And so in some ways the identity schism between Eastern Malaysia and the Peninsula is even more pronounced, and the manner in which that's politically wielded in the short term is often something to highlight. However, I have to say I'm a little less versed in goings of Borneo, and so certainly invite folks in the audience who may be more versed in this to help invite an understanding in the discussion. One area also I'd like to bring up is the symbolic and substantive status of the Malay sultanates. So in general, it's been progressively reduced in terms of their relevance to the political scene, particularly in the 80s and 90s under Mahathir. The extent to which this represents a positive or negative development, I think, again, depends on whether we consider this an important facet of the country's heritage, and also how it is that we see a way to reconcile their relevance and the construction of that heritage with the idea that Malaysia is striving to be a modern democratic society. Briefly coming on to the issue of migration, I think of the Indo-Chinese refugee crisis in the 70s and early 1990s, which impacted all the countries in ASEAN. In the Malaysian case, of course, there was rather negative disposition towards receiving ethnic Chinese refugees from Vietnam, owing to the ethnic considerations that I just discussed. But this is then juxtaposed with the comparative hospitality that Malaysia offered to around 10,000 Cambodian Cham, an estimated 200,000 Filipinos, and small amounts of Burmese and Bosnians, all of which shared the Muslim identity and from the regime's perspective at the time were comparatively less threatening to its stability. More broadly, I think the fact that most of Southeast Asia treated the mass influx of refugees as largely a problem for the global north, exemplified in their strident insistence that they could serve as countries of first asylum but not actually naturalization, is instructive, because I think this reminds us to be mindful of whether and when a society's sense of its underlying or established heritage is under threat, and the extent to which this influences policymaking, and the link that this then has inevitably to its receptivity to incorporating potentially new or different elements. So this might be norms or ideas, so I think particularly the idea of non-equal law and the refugee regime in Southeast Asia, but also, obviously more tangible ideas of different groups entering different societies. And I'm happy to talk about the more contemporary process with how ASEAN deals with kind of migration, both in terms of refugees and kind of other irregular forms as well. But if we shift again to talking about solutions, if I bring things back to Malaysia, the country's coming up now on 59 years of independence this year. And I think the divisions along ethno-religious lines, while certainly not as strong, remain important lenses by which we should understand the nation's discourse. I think this is seen in terms of the idea of defending cultural heritage when we look at the watershed elections in 2013, where the Prime Minister kind of lamented what he called the Chinese tsunami, which was when the National Front, in his view, lost a lot of ethnic Chinese voters to the opposition. And we also see this, among other recent statements, the call to defend Malay dignity, which was made by several individuals and then taken up by the Prime Minister in kind of the fomenting of sentiment for this counter-protest that took place this past October. Now, and what I'd further add is that on a broader level, when we talk about issues of citizenship, nationality, and special privileges according to the Green Literature, and the place of Islam vis-a-vis the state in Malaysia, these are issues that are both de jure and de facto third-rail issues in the day-to-day discourse of the country. And so not only is broaching them itself a feat at times, but the idea of renegotiating these questions, I think, is one that is very much left on the table. And so in that sense, I think heritage in the Malaysian context really does remain bound up in contemporary political flashpoints, with the best of agreement, if we could call it that, found in the fact that all other things equal, the average Malaysian is less interested in outright violence, see the riots in 1969, or preservation of societal stability. The cost of what I would consider this kind of stasis, however, in my estimation, remains significant in how the country tries to negotiate its contemporary heritage, and it continues to be one part of the struggle. Not to say that this is all a lost cause. We can get into this discussion. For example, I think the opposition parties have tried, if somewhat fitfully, to move beyond ethnic identifications that political parties have historically shared. And so I think it's definitely important to recognize that the political culture in Malaysia is increasingly fragmented, and this is aided by the emergence of a middle class. But my point here, I guess, in my discussion is to emphasize how entrenched this ethno-religious lens still is, and that it's very easy to appeal to this existing narrative than it is to push beyond it. In terms of the potential for harnessing economic heritage in terms of heritage in the economic sphere, I have a lot less to say here, I think, than my colleagues, but what I would just say is what come to mind are the towns of Malacca and Georgetown, both symbolic towns in the Straits. They were both granted UNESCO heritage status in 2008. And they've both done admirable jobs, I would say, in terms of embracing the rich history of settlement by Malay, Indian, Chinese communities, as well as European colonists. So in Penang, it's British, and in Malacca, I think most of you know, Portuguese and Dutch. And both of these cities have pursued strategic transformation of their infrastructure and trying to maintain the sensitivity and, to the extent possible, preservation of existing buildings and sites. I think this does get to the point Pacha made about the development of human capital and asset development. I think in both of these towns, the focus has often been on asset development, but can we perhaps, looking forward, look to how human capital development can be assisted here as well. But even when I look at Penang and Malacca, I underscore that one can't, again, get too far away from the politically mediated nature of these processes. So for example, in Malacca, the tourism, depending on who you talk to and what you see, you can sometimes get the impression that there's often a focus on the Malay identity and the Islamic heritage to the detriment of the Portuguese and Dutch. And in Penang, since it's been controlled by the opposition since 2008, coordination between federal and state authorities on kind of how to construct this narrative has been lacking. That being said, the collateral from this is that this has actually been an impetus, I think, for the state government to kind of do it and basically outdo the federal government's efforts to promote existing heritage and cultivate a contemporary understanding of it.
Thank you. So I'll briefly wrap up with for our set of discussions that we have before. I'll talk a little bit about my research about the South China Sea. just a quick note, that I know this is a very sensitive issue, so I just want to make clear that all of my comments today are my own, they do not represent any organization. You know that's real. But while I normally discuss the conflict between China and the Philippines, again, I'm a neutral party to all of this, so I just want to talk more about, I can see people are getting very interested now, what's he going to say? But I just want to talk more about the use of cultural heritage as both a driver and an instrument that I can see going in the conflict. Again, I'm not one to understand like the underwater archaeology aspects of it. I'm not sure. I have zero ability to claim on the different, I suppose, facets of how the arguments actually will play out, especially with the court case in the International Tribunal. But in any case, I just want to say that I'm a neutral party to all this. Anyway, so on the relation of the South China Sea dispute and conflict, since I'm an IR person, I'm an international relations person, I take conflict from a very far standpoint where I see it as the potential for military escalation, paramilitary escalation, any sort of escalation between countries. I do see South China Sea as a key concern. But just to relate that to the topic of cultural heritage, I see it as, like I said, I see it as a component where claimants use it, and it's also perpetuating cycles of more and more assertive actions. So to answer or to pose the question, I suppose, about why this matters, is cultural heritage itself a driver of the dispute, or is it something that's comes from the dispute, right? I answer that it's both. So first, the argument of one's heritage over an area, I think, begins as an instrument of mass organization around a single cause that most likely stems from economic factors, and I'll talk a lot about that. But after the use of that for mass mobilization, it starts to gain its own traction. And so I'll talk about the political aspects. I start with the economic causes and then move on to the political, I guess, maintenance of that cycle. So first, my research focuses on the economic foundations of the dispute. And I find that much of the dispute revolves around the resources at stake. I'm not one to conclude that it's more of the oil. I go off of the U.S. Energy Information Agency estimates that say the oil is not even in the contested areas, and a lot of the estimates range so widely. So instead, I look more at the I guess, prevalent resource at stake, and that's fish. As a report by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization notes, stocks in the area are either fully fished or overfished. Less fish means less fishermen are able to do business, but instead of curbing the problem or instituting cooperative joint resource management efforts, we're seeing claimants become even more adamant about claiming resources. China, for example, has a large maritime fishing fleet, yet a 2012 report also estimated that 80% of the fishermen would see losses that year due to the depletion of fish stocks. That's a very key concern for that industry. More ships from all states will be headed that way towards the depleted waters. From the depleted waters of their shores out to contested areas to get access to those resources, and that's a key concern, I believe. Cultural heritage as a rhetoric, therefore, serves as an instrument to rally people, because if you go out to these areas, it's very likely you will be encountering other states, other paramilitary organizations, coast guards, and we've seen numerous conflict, I wouldn't say escalation, but we've seen numerous incidents where people have been arrested, where people have even died sometimes, and that's a key concern for the people. So to get people to go out, to get people to be willing to participate in these adventures out there, cultural heritage is one way to provide more backing for that effort. This leads the public to become a little bit more risk acceptant, and using the idea of traditional fishing grounds and the defense of said traditional fishing grounds, I see as one instrument by which cultural heritage is used to push a claim on the dispute. As one Chinese fisherman testified, it is our water, but if we don't fish there, how can we claim it's our territory? China further mitigates this risk in particular by its assistance by the Coast Guard. And a highly significant example that I'd like to point out is the Chinese Maritime Militia, which there's a very interesting article on the Washington Post just the other day, actually just yesterday. But according to Chinese sources, this organization is made up of fishing members and their crew, whose operations range from civilian tasks like emergency response to rescues at sea, to also patrolling disputed areas to declare sovereignty. And even the president of China, Xi Jinping, takes special notice of them. He made a visit out there in 2013 to a fishing village and spoke about how he wants the local fishermen to assist in state efforts. He says the Communist Party and our government will make more efforts to take care of you guys. And as one analyst notes, as you urge the fishermen on with these assertion of rights, nationalisms, and claims, fishing captains know that they can take greater risks because they're going to be bailed out. That's very dangerous as the risk starts to become, more risk leads to, again, inadvertent or unintended escalation. It's a very dangerous prospect. So at this point, the argument of reclaiming heritage takes on a life of its own, because emboldening fishermen often will drag the states into tense diplomatic situations once these fishermen do get in trouble. A handful of the militia members, for example, were involved in major incidents between the Philippines that could have escalated in conflict, and sometimes did. An incident in 1995 at Ministry of Reef, that was a very tense moment. There was furthermore arrests in Scarborough Shoal in 1997. The 1999 vessel was sunk, and the 2012 Scarborough Shoal standoff, major tense point between China and Philippine relations, started over a fishing vessel that was illegally fishing and taking clams, sharks, corals, that a Chinese vessel intervened, and that started the entire standoff to escalate. So that's from a political aspect of cultural heritage. The domestic mobilization described previously serves as a negative feedback loop that leads to further entrenchment of the dispute. For the militia, the group is beginning to take on their own heritage, though, and this is where it gets very interesting with the group's aspect itself, because they're now creating heritage in the form of museums honoring previous militia members. They have memorabilia such as compasses, ship logs, and goggles from previous members, enshrining glass cases, and that itself is tangible heritage that they're preserving from fishermen who stood up for their traditional fishing grounds in the past. They pass on wisdom and traditions as intangible heritage. So the more that they build their own heritage, the more that identity becomes concrete within them. So this has the potential to lead to further escalation. The momentum of the public also restrains the government's freedom of action during the disputes themselves. During the particularly tense 2012 standoff between China and the Philippines, for example, both states had a lot of pushback from the governments to do more. One measure was to institute fishing bans over the area that would prevent fishermen from entering the area on their own, which would certainly complicate the situation since the entire incident began with that fishing vessel. But domestic publics increasingly will become upset by how the site is seen to be making concessions, violating the commitment to reclaim their heritage sites. For example, some Philippine fishermen protested that their sovereign rights are being grossly denied and destroyed. Another testimony from China even noted that many Chinese, including military officers, have said popular anger could grow if Beijing remains too soft in responding to rival claims in the South China Sea. A few individuals were even willing to take matters into their own hands. One Philippine Marine captain, for example, prepared to conduct a patriotic voyage by sailing to the atoll himself to occupy them. But it took the President Aquino, to actually go and speak to him to discourage him from doing such an action. But with all the danger of the negative feedback loop for cultural heritage as nationalist rhetoric, there's also opportunities. I see it as this closer state-society interaction, for example, in the militia members, as one way where we can use closer government organization in a good way. This shifts the attention of efforts, instead from necessarily the societal aspects, but now we can bring government more involved. If they become more involved, we will have a focus on preservation rather than extensions into the area unilaterally, and it will prevent lone actors at the same time from taking measures on their own that might inadvertently spark conflict in the hard sense, let's say. This is a benefit, and it will take some time for the political will to reverse course on kind of the path that's going on right now. But I definitely believe we can see cooperative measures for dealing with these territory disputes. That's all from me, though. But anyway, I'd like to open the floor up to questions now and discussion. And luckily, we do have a small group here today, so we can talk with each other. We can discuss about the points made and make it a very interactive process, let's say. So I'm going to pose a few questions, and you're welcome to pose a few questions yourself, and we'll just let the discussion flow amongst us. And if you have at any point in time a question or comment or thing you'd like to say, just please raise your hand. I'll pause the discussion. We'll give you the floor, and then we'll bring it back up and we'll keep it going. Anyway, does anyone have any questions, comments they'd like to start off with? If not, I have some for the panel, so that would be. So I know some of us talked a little bit about ASEAN, right? We talked about the uniquenesses of ASEAN and its role, whether it's in an institutional organization. Tasha, I know you have some more that you want to talk about in terms of ASEAN, that institutional role. Do you mind expanding a little bit more about that? Or?
Well, the thing with ASEAN that I didn't get to explore much into is how, kind of on the surface level at the moment, that it's tapping into the potential of heritage. There's no mechanism to synchronize even the definition of how it wants to approach heritage, how each country wants to coordinate heritage. There's barely efforts to kind of deal with problems, mechanism frameworks which government can rely on to deal with disputes concerning heritage in ASEAN itself as a mechanism. So things like counterfeiting, smuggling cross borders, or even larger cases where you have heritage that might be shared between two countries. So these mechanisms is something on institutional level that governments need to start working towards. On a more kind of economic level where people can get access, a lot of countries still doesn't have the mechanisms necessary for private heritage protection laws. And when I'm talking about heritage protection laws, I want to bring up a bit on the case of the English heritage system, which the thing with heritage is that there's a really high chance, especially historical heritage, that it will be on the land of a private individual. The government needs to have mechanism to direct and preserve these assets. But as currently is, I can speak only for the case of the law of Thailand, even though you can declare protection on these sites, most of the time the sites are destroyed because the government has no real verdict over what happens on the site and they don't have monitoring capacities. So how do we fix this problem in terms of assisting the local private interests so that they don't destroy the site? So I brought up the English Heritage Fund because it's a good example of how good set up trust fund financial mechanisms and right incentive legal structure where government intervenes and actually can stop you from destroying heritage site on your own land, can actually turn that particular piece of land into an income or business opportunity for the landowner if they choose to cooperate with the government. Currently, if a Thai landowner finds a site or temple on his land, he doesn't get to touch that particular asset. And that is a kind of an incentive conflict between the people and the government, whether they want to report or just take that piece of artifact or temple and sell it off to some museum dealer. So that institutionalized.
Yes, please.
Actually, this the thing you mentioned about ASEAN and the cooperating with each other on like issues of heritage. I was bringing up with a particular issue, but not about physical artifacts, but rather like just the idea of like history. I'm Thai, I don't know the background. Like in Thailand especially, history has been used as a mechanism for nation building. Now, whereas in Europe, history between each different countries is largely fairly synchronized, for lack of a better word. Whereas in Southeast Asia, there's a lot of sort of conflicts within each particular country's recollection of what happened in history. I was wondering how does that play in this attempt to, for ASEAN to actually have some sort of a cohesive policy towards heritage.
Oh, actually, sorry, do you mind introducing yourself?
Oh, sorry, my name is Kanaya. I'm from the University of Manchester in sociology.
Perfect. Yes, if you have any comments or questions, just so you could introduce yourself for the first time. Sorry, I forgot to mention that earlier, but anyway, for the panel, what do you think?
We were actually having that same conversation when we were preparing the panel. So we were like, how do you, history can be used for so many different things. So it can be used to build bridges by shared identity, by shared experiences of the past, but it can also be used to divide people. So, I mean, you've got, if you look at the example of how Europeans considered nationalism or national identity, you've got two examples. You've got the German example of the 19th century, where wherever you were born, it didn't matter as long as you were born into the German culture. So if you were born in Australia, you would still be German, according to 19th century German nationalism. Whereas according to the French idea of nationalism, you were part of the French nation if you abided by the laws that were agreed by the people living in the country. So that is I think that is the one, let's say that's the ideal one. But in reality, even in Europe, we have a lot of difficulties in creating hybrid identities. So if someone is not white and they say that they're from Norway, we're gonna have that, for instance, like, oh, but where are you really coming from, you know? Because it's not like in the US where you have that mixed identity where you can say that you're Asian American or you're African American. So we don't have that. Like I'm from Spain, and in Spain we haven't received like large numbers of foreigners until the 80s, and the massive influx came later in the 1990s. So before that, it was very, like, you wouldn't see black people on the streets. It would be very, very hard. And said they were Americans because they had the air bases there. So I mean, even our perception of black people were based on those, because our first contact with black people would have been with Americans. So, I mean, you can see the two ways of doing it, but still, I mean, history can be used in any single way. It just depends on how you want to stir people up. But obviously, I mean, language and culture are, for the example of Spain particularly, you have the Catalonian nation, and they call themselves a nation because they have a different language. So language is a key issue in their identity. You've got the Basque, who actually say they're even more different because they have the Basque language, which is so weird. So they don't consider themselves to be Spanish because of the language. And if they lost the language, then they wouldn't have that strong claim, or that's what they think. And even the Spanish government kind of thinks that way too. So how does that, I'm not really sure how that works in Southeast Asia.
Well, my perception on it is that if you start using history for nation building and identity, and I think to a certain extent all nations does this as part of their heritage, because you need to have some sort of identity. But once you use history, there's always going to be a hate factor at some point in history. But it's more of teaching and educating the population and general perception to be aware of the hate factor and to reconcile with the hate factor as something that has happened in the past. It doesn't mean a shutdown of the hate factor, but maybe a more broad discussion of the hate factor in general.
And I think, along those lines, when it comes to ASEAN in particular, historically the idea of non-interventionism has been a big thing for ASEAN, right? And so in terms of this hate factor that's maybe in the past and kind of moving beyond that, I think this is a contemporary question about how, as we forge ASEAN, you have the economic community and the other pillars, can you, as you say, forge some sort of ASEAN identity? But I think there's two other things I'd bring up here. One is, the first point about, is it going to be economics that leads it, and then it kind of the political follows through? Do you have to have both functioning on the same level, or does one kind of happen before the other? And then also kind of the question in the background of my mind is, and I think you're getting at it as well, is there a model that will fit ASEAN that will be different, right? Because we're kind of implicitly looking to Europe oftentimes and saying this is the regionalism, this is the kind of way that we will forge through. But is it so teleological and does it have to proceed in that way, or is there another way to do it that will be ASEAN specific and still allow for kind of these embedded heritages, let's say, and all that mess and complexity. But as I call it a mess, I think that very much hints at how much it's a complicated process.
Just was
Kevin Fogg from the Faculty of History. You all didn't talk much about intangible cultural heritage, but this is one of the places where we've actually had large-scale street protests across the region contesting intangible cultural heritage. We've had protests in Indonesia for Malaysia stealing theirs. We've had contention between Singapore trying to pull in the Baba Nyonya as a Singapore thing, which Malaysia's happy to get rid of, except for the Malaysian Chinese are not happy to get rid of. And intangible cultural heritage, actually, on a UNESCO level, is one of the areas where ASEAN has been exceedingly successful. ASEAN sort of rates of acceptance of their applications for intangible cultural heritage are above any other region on Earth, right? I mean, they're much better at making applications that are successful. How does intangible cultural heritage play into this in a way that is very different from physical sites, from physical heritage?
less with the intangible side, but anyone else to talk about that?
I don't wanna, you wanna,
I think you might be the best person.
Well, I mean, so it's interesting. I'm not as well versed with the UNESCO side of things, and so in terms of those applications, I can't speak so much to that. But the fact that there are so many, also, it sounds like that that it's a space that it seems like these communities very much want to get that acceptance for. But the fact that there are a lot of protests suggests to me that, and in my own personal experience as well, that it's a space that's clearly very contested. Whether that manifests beyond protests and actually, moves to a level of conflict, I don't know. I think there's definitely anecdotally folks that will say, yeah, they're stealing our culture, sort of thing, and that happens a lot. Certainly in Malaysia, and I'm sure you can attest to this, as you mentioned, in Indonesia and Thailand as well. As to how that can be, let's say, institutionally dealt with, as Pasha mentioned, kind of getting those cooperative measures to be taken up at the intergovernmental level, I don't know.
I think the problem with Southeast Asia in terms of intangible cultural heritage identity is that there is a sense of exclusivity among each nation on what they perceive as theirs and theirs alone. So I think ASEAN as an organization should, maybe increase more publications, increase more awareness, kind of sit down and say, okay, we have these similarities, for example, the Baba-Nyonya culture, and this is going to exist in every area that has Peranakan. Okay? But inform the public, because the Peranakans in Phuket, the Peranakans in Penang, and the Peranakans that you find in Singapore have slightly variations with different cultures. And I think more awareness of similarities but minor nuances and differences will get rid of that sentiment of this is ours, exclusive ours, and only ours, and related to our ethnicity alone.
So I hate to tell an economic historian about economics, but is this not an issue of who's going to get the gravy train off of this culture, right? The reason that the Javanese are so stinking upset about Malaysia having shadow puppet shows is not because they want to claim it as national heritage, it's because they want the money off of people watching shadow puppet shows, right? And without an economic solution to getting those tourism dollars in, or getting those sale dollars in of the cultural products, be it maki or whatever else it is, it's going to be mighty hard to solve this as an understanding level, can't we all just get along? This is a point of conflict that is economic, in the way that you all were pointing to very productively, that plays out as cultural heritage. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, we actually, when we were discussing what kind of questions we could debate, we came up with this idea of, you had more thoughts on it, but the ASEAN doesn't really have a body that would actually regulate cultural heritage. Because obviously tourism is a great industry, and now you've got this ability to tap into that source. And every country in Southeast Asia could benefit from it. Because if you look at tourists coming from Europe or from the US, it's quite a far away place. And you've got a lot of backpackers who have this tendency of staying over for over a month. So if you're going to be in a region over a month, you want to do island hopping, you want to go around and visit everywhere. So everyone can potentially benefit, and they would work together better than by hindering, for example, mobility of people.
This reminds me of something you actually told me about before, the particular Spanish sweet that was taken from the Arabs. And you find in the Arab world, but the Spanish has customized it to their tradition. Maybe you can expand more on that, because this is something that is heritage. You have across the Mediterranean belt where the Arabs went,
Yes.
but still Spain managed to profit from it, and the Arab world and different countries also can sell it.
Well, my example was from the Christmas sweets that we have in Spain. And if you look at them, they're very much Arab. But obviously Spain has this tradition of breaking away from the Islamic kingdom of Al-Andalus. and pushing them out. So I think that as a way to incorporate traditions, they made those traditions into Christian traditions. So we only have that kind of sweets during Christmas celebrations. Obviously that was later transported also to the Philippines. The Philippines have the same kind of sweets in the region, and they're associated with Christmas. So that's a way that they did to change. But I don't know, I haven't spoken with anyone from an Islamic country to see what they feel about that. Because they probably would say like, oh, this is ours. Because we have that issue where people would say like anything that's in Al-Andalus, it's from the Arabs because we made this. I mean, they have a point, they did make it, so.
Yeah, I think in general, I mean, it's a struggle to have diffuse identities, kind of geographically spread out, and yet trying to claim something as kind of your own exclusively. And in a different way, I'm not as well versed in this, but I'm reminded, I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with the Mandala system, and there's a blog from Australian National University called New Mandala. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that as well, but I think when we come to a kind of question about ASEAN and kind of how do you have kind of these diffuse kind of forms of identity and authority for different issues, whether it's tangible or intangible, and is that a model that ASEAN can use productively, or is it actually going to foment kind of by not resolving questions and having such a diffuse kind of process, just kind of keep things entrenched and then kind of let them fester?
I mean, part of economic process is about customizing according to time. So if you are really creative about it, you can actually establish an edge instead of fighting over what was theirs, but develop from that instead. And ASEAN needs a mediating mechanism to actually help governments reconcile that similarity that becomes economic interest.
Sorry, real quickly.
Yeah, my name is Michael. I'm an archaeologist from the University of Sydney. What I was thinking was that when it comes to intangible cultural heritage, this is something that's really meant to be led by the community level. This isn't something that's instituted by nation states. So really this is an opportunity for small communities spread out across Southeast Asia to connect with each other.
I think, so I view this as a larger effort on how archaeologists goes into a site and work with the sites and the local communities. In terms of what the direction of generating, actually creating what we call creative economy, knowledge-based economy, these impacts are minimal, and it's a bit marginal in terms of opportunity access without proper state mechanisms to actually help them. And the Utong site is a very good example of communities who are very keen on engaging, have archaeologists, academics in there telling them what they have, but no one is helping them in terms of intellectual property law to prevent people from stealing their products to begin with, or even how they can manage this particular asset and direct it towards a more urban sector or urban access to the mainstream market to increase the value of their products. So it ends up being sold as something that is rare for tourists who happen to pass by, but the price and valuation that their products or the site could receive is not reaching the ultimate level, at least that's my perspective on it.
Actually, just sorry to add on that a bit. It's about the community involvement and the community ownership of heritage, such like. But what happens when kind of like new evidence, whether found by archaeologists or historians and such like, contradicts what the locals seem to be as a heritage? Like, for example, the case of Tao Suranari in Thailand, where there was somebody kind of found a lot of new some historical evidence that maybe puts her contribution to the doubt and ended up literally getting run out of the town. So can you tell us how to kind of like maybe kind of like so how would you kind of like deal with that issue of basically like when history or heritage being found becoming seen as a threat to the local identity?
That's an issue even within archaeologists, because you have there is no real consensus, because I mean Southeast Asian archaeology is relatively new, so there is no real consensus on many different things, and you've got the epic feud between Joyce White and Charles Hyam, and then they would just go to each other's conferences and say, oh, you're wrong, oh, you're wrong. It's amazing, it's really exciting for a conference like to attend. It's really exciting to actually see it, because they won't back down. They have different propositions, and I mean, they're not even that off. Like, they're not that different in what they're trying to say. One says like there was a violence time, and there was no, it was peaceful, but and it's amazing. Even within archaeologists, that happens, and so how is it? That's even going to be far worse for the people if they get their identity threatened, let's say, and they may not believe what archaeologists have to say. Like, I mean, you've got this idea of whether the Khmer people were coming from the Moon River Valley or whether they were coming actually from the Tonle Sap area, and apparently, well, it is like there are still people who actually believe that they came from the Moon River Valley, while a lot of people are now considering that they only came from around the Tonle Sap area. So I guess that, you know, like there's always this change that happens in the academic level, and it eventually that permeates down. It just doesn't happen overnight. So people will still believe that the Cham invaded Angkor because they were using Chinese sailor to go upstream, while we think that never happened. So that, I mean, that kind of stuff is always going to happen. But maybe in 20 years, when there are more publications, when we actually decide what we think is the truth amongst academics, then that can be passed on to the general public. And then, until then, I mean, they can really believe whatever they want to.
I mean, this case reminds me of another site in Chonburi that I visited. The communities there genuinely believe that they are descendants from the royalty settlement was there. And when the site was registered, it's told that there are actually lands that were taken during the beginning of the 19th century and moved there to be settled. But that community, as an effort to counteract that, has come up with their own very localized history, and which involves a lot of mystical folklores to accommodate their relations to that particular site. So, I mean, my take on it is that there's popular history and there's history that we as academics care about. I think they care more about popular history and those things for themselves.
But do the academics not have an interest in influencing the popular history? I mean, or maybe that's a unsaid question.
That depends on whether the academics wants to make money.
Sorry, we go to that.
Yeah, hi, I'm Zibing. I'm just like history and as an observer. What I'm interested in is from what I've been observing, most war and conflicts are from trade and a lot of economical aspects of it. So, like in Europe, I mean, if you look back in history, this state with continuous 7,000 years of history, quite successful, and this quite new country with 700, but also very successful of history. Now, within Europe, the reason why EU started was to create this security, avoid war, and how they're going to unite all these different cultures together. It was one vision. I think it started by the French and German government initiative to just combine them together, use the economical drive, and what we've seen through the crisis 2008, they didn't care. They just wanted to dump the money in just to grow. EU as itself and some territory dispute in Syria or Ukraine with Russia, so on and so forth. Now, my question is, in Europe, especially in the UK, we've always seen EU as a economical rather than a similar federal state like in the US. But I suppose in the continental European country, they see as a federal state. I might be wrong, but this is how I observe it. So with the success of Asiana, what kind of model do you think they should take? Should it be more economical driven, or a federal state where you start to build all this culture, taking heritages, combine them together, so on and so forth? Because I suppose in Asia, there's a lot of people movement throughout history. So there will be a lot of cross-culture, and it's been very continuous. So is that the roots in establishing the foundation of Asiana? Or would you drive it more from the economical aspect, where there's more government willpower to come together? What would the drive be?
I can give you my opinion of why I think the European Union has not worked, or it couldn't. I don't think that it's a good model, or at least it's a model that you can see as an example with further examples or tinier examples of what things don't work. Because I think that from a political point of view, you have a lot of. I was an officer in charge of the Erasmus program, so I know that the Erasmus program, for example, which is a university exchange throughout the whole of Europe, worked really well in learning how other people do things in Europe. So suddenly you have like a lot of people throughout the whole of Europe with friends from everywhere around Europe. That was really positive. I think that was one of the best things that had ever come out from Europe, because then you see the other person as an individual. You don't see it, as the Germans, the French, the Spanish and the French, they hate each other. And you have that kind of regional problems all the time. But the moment you meet a person within a nice environment, then you're going to take that person as a good example. It's like, yeah, the French are awful, but that guy that I met, he was really nice, So you've got that as a really good example of how to actually unite people. However, because of the economic crisis and the inability of, in our case, the southern countries, to get hold of our economies, we have felt completely abandoned by the northern countries. And I mean, there's a lot of there's a difference of the way that we do things, and that was not incorporated into the idea of creating a new Europe. So the Europe that we have is a Europe that some countries in the north have designed without taking into account the idiosyncrasies of the countries in the south. So I don't think that we fit that much. That's my opinion.
Yeah, so on that was my point. So on that, would you say, because like in Europe, what I've observed is the culture are not as long and continuous as compared to Asia. I might be wrong, as in Asia, because from what you just discussed earlier, there's a lot of conflict about arguing about who the heritage culture, who it belongs to, because there's so much similarity. So maybe it might be easier for Asian country to start from the heritage and culture side building rather compared to Europe, because they may not have that much similarity. Am I wrong saying that? And it sounds like you were more hinting towards the economical
I don't know. I wouldn't
growth.
say, because I think we're. I wouldn't like to compare that, because we've been very bellicose in Europe. So we've developed. We have a European identity, let's say, but then we also have very strong regional identities. And even within countries, you have very strong regional identities. So I don't know to what extent. I think that there are tools to sort of like learn from other people and humanize the others. But there was a strong, I think, I did history, but I didn't specialize in contemporary history, so maybe you can have better ideas. But in the 19th century, there was like a strong idea of creating this idea of the other. So like nations were like really like they're trying to take pride in what they were and generating this idea of the other.
Yeah, I think that was my point, because certain areas, like the Far East, they got a longer, continuous, I think the key was continuous history, and there's a lot of trade and migration going around. But if you look at Europe, it's quite broken up. What I've seen for the past 10, 20 years in the UK is an example. Because of the EU, suddenly, within the UK, it starts to not have this identity. I'm English, I'm Welsh, I'm Scottish.
Yeah.
Speaking to people like from UK, it's like, this has never happened before in the past 30, 40 years, and suddenly with this EU, everyone started to divide up. Now, again, coming back to Asia, because the culture seems to be very similar, and it's continuous. Not like in the West, they really established themselves maybe for the past couple of hundred years, rather certain cultures, several thousand. I think my point is like, in Asiana, would there be a case where it might work, where we concentrate more on the culture as a priority rather than economic, or would you say economic would drive it more than the culture? Because in EU, we're having this debate about, do you stick with economic because that's what UK wants, and that's where the dispute is. Whereas the mainland continent, they want just to drive from political side, create the EU feel, because they are still within the mainland, and they want to break that barrier, so economic can last. So hence, the major nation who really funding it is probably the rich one, maybe Germany and France, and they would rebate to the poor country to create that equilibrium, because capitalism is all based about level playing field. And for example, the rich nation like UK, who are funding part of it, they would get rebate in the future. But UK is not happy with the situation, so forth and so on, because they don't want to relinquish this nationality and sovereignty, because UK are advanced in many aspects. But that's of course all the conflict about uniting it, because as a nation you need like security, economic, social, like all these different pillars. So they're struggling. But with Asiana, I mean, do you think it's easier because of the similarity in culture and it's a bit longer? I mean, from what you guys were discussing about this.
Okay, I think I would push back a bit on your similarity contention about Asia and ASEAN. I think because you talked about culture and economics, but I think often, as you mentioned a little bit, the nation and how the state mediates those cultures. And so, you know, whether you're in Indonesia and you're talking about Aceh, Timor, West Papua, you're in Malaysia, you're talking about Sabah and the disputes with the Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia as well. I think when you get to how those cultures then get mediated into sorts of entities that organize themselves in some sort of cohesive, centralized way, there's a fair amount of contestation over that similarity. I think also, I mean, seeing Southeast Asia or ASEAN as an idea is relatively new in terms of the history, right? So we're talking 1960s, the formation of ASEAN, and then for securitized reasons, the idea of seeing ASEAN as kind of a bulwark for the US in terms of Cold War and things like that. And I also think when you talked about the movement of peoples and the way that we see how that's being addressed in the contemporary period, namely that it's often securitized, at least if we're talking about irregular migration. So highly skilled migration, I think, is a separate story. But in terms of irregular migration, it's often lower skilled. The fact that it's securitized, and it's often in the language about identity and culture and preservation, says to me that it's still a very contested space and quite problematic. In terms of your broader question about would it be economic driven or more, let's say, politically in a broad sense driven, I think one other thing to inject into here is this discussion about the EU points out that often the integrative processes are often thought of in terms of top-down, elite-driven. And is that the way that integration is best done? Is that the most feasible and kind of sustainable? Or, as we were talking about, community-driven archaeological sort of things, is it kind of a bottom-up process that, you know, by necessity is much slower and perhaps doesn't kind of provide the same fruits, but perhaps is more long-lasting? I don't know. It's certainly something to be left out there, but
the lovely thing about institutions is that it could choose to intervene healthily, or it could choose to intervene only for the short-term purposes, which most government ends up in that trap where policies are engaged and you throw money at something, you set up a project, and the end of that project is the end of the momentum that takes place. The Erasmus Mundus and a lot of programs that were engaged in Europe would not have been possible without a degree of top-down intervention. How they design that top-down intervention is another matter.
We actually are running out of time, so I just want to give it back to you guys. Do you guys have any last thoughts on the topic at hand, cultural heritage, conflict? What are some of the last words that you'd like to, I guess, leave with us? We've talked about many topics today, but what do you think are the key points that you'd like to, that you drop out from the discussion? Pasha, what do you think?
I think it's a cultural heritage in a way. It's a powerful tool for development and conflict mitigation, but there's a really high chance that we can actually abuse this. And just to go back on the objective of using it as a development tool, a lot of institutions need to be set up in order to generate the multiplier effects that we see in a lot of places, and including Europe itself, where we have huge heritage sites benefiting. Rome wasn't created without mechanisms, and that's something that ASEAN needs to kind of move towards open up to bearing in mind that, like Rome, there's a lot of Roman sites across Europe, and there are a lot of similar sites, Khmerian-related sites, in both Thailand and Cambodia. How do you market the differences between these two? That doesn't lead to conflict, and that's something that we should consider in the future.
What do you think?
Well, a little bit like Pasha said, like cultural heritage is a double-edged sword, and it can be used both to divide and to unite people. So in the political arena, we can see that narratives of otherness are usually based on difference, and cultural heritage can be used to mark that division between the us and the others. However, cultural heritage can also contribute to the construction of bridges between communities, as we can see from the UNESCO's PAFA training programs that I mentioned. So cultural heritage can also be used as a means for poverty alleviation, which Pasha had already pointed. So taking advantage of cultural heritage to develop tourism is a viable option to bring wealth to a region, but there needs to be a balance between the interests of the different stakeholders. So I would simply point out the importance of ensuring that any exploitation of the sites cannot lead to their destruction, because they're still really important resources for archaeologists and historians alike. So this should be a priority in every project, since cultural heritage sites are non-renewable. We have to emphasize the fact that they're non-renewable. Once you excavate them, you have to conserve them. If you don't conserve them, they're probably going to be destroyed. So you have to think about the costs associated with the excavation of sites for tourism. And you have to promote a long-term vision of conservation. And so all in all, cultural heritage is, as I said, a powerful tool that can be used for good things and for bad things. And like Uncle Ben told Peter Parker, with great power comes great responsibility.
And on that note, in the sense of the question of how do you preserve kind of these embedded heritages with this idea of this ASEAN integration that's kind of pushing forward, I think it's an unresolved empirical question that a lot of folks in many different ways, both top down and bottom up, are wrestling with. And I think it's an indeterminate sort of thing, but I think how you negotiate that process and whether you do it whether it's done in a concerted manner or kind of just kind of ad hoc will kind of be important to keep a watch on, at least from an observer's perspective. But clearly that tension between preserving what's there and kind of bringing it into the contemporary era, or whatever it is that means, is a long-standing one, and is something that needs to be negotiated, to put it lightly.
And then I'll just say that from the discussion today, I'll bring in another movie quote and say that with regards to cultural heritage, the force is strong with this one. But anyway, I'd like to sincerely thank you all for coming. I'd like to especially thank PJ Toom and the entire Project Southeast Asia staff for helping us to put this panel on. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much for coming.
Sorry about the crying babies and
Yeah, I totally agree with that one.
These crying babies, crying babies, crying babies.
I thought it was a popular kids episode.
Sandy was big, yeah. How's your break?
Sorry.
No, it's the metaphoric simple.
Still summer job.
And what do you best from?
Were you in South Korea this break?
Are you just attending, or are you also?
I presented yesterday.
Yes. So I've got this process around the team and depending on my grade, depending on my grade, how so I need to get a first for both when you also honor science and he says it's also about
Hey, archaeologists. Nice to meet you.
we walked to the
No, I cannot
Anyways,
attend, because I have to write my thesis. Are you going?
A number of applications. I don't know.
You're from Sydney. Awesome.
So I didn't discuss getting the offers.
But yes, no, I remember going to Copenhagen.
where are you going?
I'll be in
Yeah.
Indonesia.
Yeah, at the beginning I was kind of thinking about that, and I was like, I don't know what archaeologist.
Sure, you're on.
Independent.